Zed in Life is brought to you by ZN, the OG digital agency in Brussels.
And live from the internet, it's ZN Live. And welcome to episode 399. I'm your host, Phil Weiss, CEO and founder of ZN. With me, my co-host is Evie, who is an expert account manager and strategist at ZN. And our very special guest today is James Kanter. So James is an experienced journalist. He has been working for many years across a range of different topics. And recently, or I don't know, not so recently, he has launched EU Scream to redefine podcasting in the EU. And he was there with us at the EU Influencer event a month ago, where we were discussing trends and journalism and misinformation. And I want to go to a specific question, James. At the event, we talked about channels and the problems with X and uncertainty. And I just wanted to get, what was your big takeaway from that conversation?
Yeah, well, Phil, Evelina, first of all, it's a really nice opportunity. It's great to be back on your show. And, the influencer event that you just mentioned, I mean, it's become a really nice part of my Brussels story. So thanks for that. And thanks for involving me this year. I guess what really stayed with me from the event itself was this moment, Phil, where you asked the audience to raise their hands and to indicate what social media they were using. And quite a lot of arms went up for Instagram, quite a lot for LinkedIn, but there were very few that went up in the air for X. And I have to we can speculate on why that is. I mean, maybe some people are just shy about expressing the idea that they're still on that platform. But to me, it was a very interesting result. I mean, there is a stigma now over using X that's begun to set in, which is, interesting in even never rock the boat Brussels. So that was one thing that I really took away from that event that stays with me.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because actually, we've been running this event for 8 years now, and it was really a Twitter event at the beginning. When we started, all the people there were Twitter influencers, and we were ranking Twitter. We were not really looking at the other channels. And in recent years, since the Musk acquisition, we started to try to figure out, what is happening. There were, by the way, regular complaints about Twitter. So it's not that people didn't say like, oh my God, there's so many trolls, it's so horrible. But I think today, when we asked people in the room, what is your favorite channel? That was the question, is what's your favorite one? So it doesn't mean they don't use Twitter or X, but they basically feel increasingly uncomfortable. And as you mentioned, there was a shift towards LinkedIn. I think for me, the difficulty is that we just don't know where this is landing, and we don't know if there's going to be a kind of pillar channel that people can really focus on, or we've entered this kind of changing multi-channel world. How do you feel about it personally? Where are you spending your time?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know what to do. I have a decent following on X that I built up over the years, so I'm like a lot of people in that regard, and it is tough to get traction on some of the new microblogs like Threads or Blue Sky or Mastodon, all of which are fine, and they're very interesting conversations going on there. But all of that work that somebody like me did investing in X over actually what was the better part of a decade, I mean, that kind of work is very hard to put into a new platform if you've got other stuff going on in your life. So it's a real dilemma. Look, I think some very tough things are said about X. My position is that I would never really tell anyone to stop posting to X or stop using X, but what people like me are pleading for is to keep thinking creatively about how to diminish the draw of Musk's platform in favor of something better. And there are a lot of people you're going to see who are going to invoke free speech arguments to say, don't mess with X and that kind of thing. But, I just don't buy into that. We've got to keep thinking creatively about a way out of this issue. I mean, just today, we learned that Musk has been in regular contact with Vladimir Putin and other Kremlin officials since late 2022. Extraordinary. I mean, the man has a lot of depraved views. He is platforming some of the most hateful people on earth, and he's been doing that since he bought Twitter. And this is incredibly problematic when you think how much he has changed and ruined this emergent global town square.
Yeah, but I want to go back a little bit because I remember very distinctly after 2016 when most of the rage was directed at Zuckerberg and Facebook. Cambridge Analytica was there, and people saying, "Oh my God, you let it happen! People have kind of hacked your platform," and so there was this intense kind of barrage of attacks against Zuckerberg. Now suddenly he's kind of looking to some people like the reasonable person in this conversation. I suspect that people will never tire of attacking the platform owners because they are like a media. Like Rupert Murdoch is running a bunch of channels, and people can absolutely not like them, but sometimes say, I want to get some of the exposure I can get from those channels. Do you think there's a world in which we don't worry about the ownership of the channels? Because I mean, LinkedIn is Microsoft owned, Threads and all that are owned by Zuckerberg, and then we have Mastodon, which is open source, but until it gets serious, and maybe then you discover that there's an issue of ownership there. So do you think this is actually going to be solved, or that we live in a changing world?
Look, I don't know if it's going to be solved, but I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to somebody as distasteful in their views as Rupert Murdoch, at least his news empire is regulated as a news organization. So there are certain restrictions on what they can publish, and they can be sued, as they have been, for stuff that makes its way into their newspapers. Everyone must be able to remember the hacking scandals and so on and so forth in the UK. Now, when it comes to the platforms, they still do not face these kinds of restrictions that full-blown media organizations have. They've worked very hard. They've lobbied very hard. And that is the work of Musk, and that is the work of Zuckerberg, and that is the work of the people who run these platforms, to have no liability for what kind of content appears on their platforms. And I think that that's what, in a way, makes them ripe for regulation. This is not a conversation that we can just drop. Something needs to change. How that changes, I don't know. A lot will depend on politics.
Yeah, no, but I think we're going to see regulation, and we're already seeing it emerging in Europe, that tries to create a framework. I think that there's still a lot of work to do to make sure that society catches up with the fact that these are incredibly important channels for the future. Now, talking about EU conversations in the Brussels bubble, last week we attended together the press review, which is, for those who don't know, a moment when Brussels journalists go on stage, make fun of themselves, of the EU, and you discover these amazing talents that people have. So I know that you hadn't been there in a while. So how was your experience of the press review this year?
Well, first of all, it was great. It was great being with you there, chatting with you there. I mean, these things are important because there is nothing like humor to pillory those in power. And I have to say that what really worked for me this year, as you say, I mean, we haven't seen the press review since COVID, but what really worked for me this year was the musical numbers. And big shout out for Jeff Mead, for Craig Winokur, and Jack Schickler for some of their sketches. Craig, I'll just tell you what they are. I'll sketch out what they were because they were pretty good. Craig did a newly elected member of the European Parliament singing Clowns to the left of me, Jokers to the right, which is a song by Steelers Wheels, stuck in the middle with you, which worked really well. Jeff Mead sang Welcome to the Midday Briefing to the tune of Hotel California. You might get very little information there, but you can't really ever leave. And again, maybe that doesn't work in translation, but it was very funny at the time. And then Jack Schickler did this version of a French 70s number called Blues Du Businessman, where he's playing Thierry Breton, the Frenchman who was effectively ousted from the European Commission. And Breton, as channeled by Jack, is lamenting, and Jack sent me the lyrics here. He's lamenting how I should have had a second term to carry through my policies to help every smaller firm bring big tech to its knees. So now I'm being sent away. No more driver, no more pay, no job, no cabinet, thanks to Stéphane Séjourné, not even a job with Barnier. Now, this is very nerdy inside Brussels stuff, but it was funny, and all of them had the room in stitches. So I really liked it. But, one more thought here, if I may. Like I said, nothing like humor to pillory those in power, but it's also good for bringing those hateful forces in our society down to size. It's actually pretty hard to counteract ridicule. And Craig did a version of The Boxer by Simon and Garfunkel, which was about Brexit politicians who lie, la, lie, lie, la, lie, 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 la, lie, which again had the whole hall in hysterics. So I thought that was pretty cool.
I think you have potential that you should talk to Jeff and see whether there's a room for you next year. But no, I agree.
Jeff would have to agree to have the whole band, which is called Toy Division, which is a band that I'm in, and we do some satirical songs as well. So maybe we should have a role. But something to talk
absolutely. No, I agree. I'm amazed at how enduring these talented journalists are. You always feel that, secretly they wish they were actors or singers or performers. It's kind of like you can see how much they enjoy it. And I was amazed. I agree with you. Craig deserves a shout out. I hadn't seen him perform before. So I thought he did a fantastic job. So it was great. And it's true. Humor is very important in having more open conversation where everything doesn't have to be about hating each other and polarization, as we're seeing in much of society today. And actually, this was another conversation we had at the EU Influencer, which is how does the conversation evolve in this new environment where journalism is kind of moving online? You yourself have moved from journalism to podcasting, and I wanted to know, how has the transition been? How do you like podcasting? Has it become your new identity? And do you still consider yourself a journalist, or is that part of your life over and now you're a podcaster / influencer?
Well, look, I'm certainly a journalist first and foremost. That remains the case. Good narrative is a must. Facts are sacred. That's a big continuity with my previous career with big papers like International Herald Tribune and New York Times, but even going back to when I started out in Phnom Penh in Cambodia as the editor of the Cambodia Daily. However, doing the work that I do, yes, I'm also a content creator. And some of my episodes, which is why they're episodic, they take hundreds of hours to make, hundreds of hours. And you still hear people saying, oh, podcast is easy, low bar of entry, digital audio files are cheap and so on and so forth, thanks to the internet, easy to distribute. But making content that's listenable and enriching, it's just not like that. It takes a while and all the journalistic skills that you can muster. And influencer, well, journalists have always been influencers in some ways, and podcast is now increasingly central to media, politics, and policy. And you can certainly see that with some episodes of EU Scream that have been picked up by big newspapers. Our our conversation with Ilva Johansson by Süddeutsche Zeitung, for instance, Laura Walters, an MEP by Le Soir. So these are important contributions to journalism here in our community. But I do think it's also incredibly interesting to think about what's going on in the United States in the current build up to November 5th, to the US election. Kamala Harris has gone out of her way, to go and talk to new media, including podcasts. And I think that signals a very, very interesting shift in how the media environments are going to be working in the future.
I totally agree. And I think also that, it's like with the type of podcast that you are, it's like doing, it is important to establish, it's like a good research basis before, it's like you publish anything, because it's also very, very informative for the public. So you cannot just go, and basically, merge some information together and just make an episode out of that. Because, at the end of the day, you're a journalist and this is the work that you're portraying. From my side, I wanted to ask, you've mentioned, like Kamala Harris, like the rise of podcasts, her, attending podcasts that have been seen as more informal. I think in the past month was also quite shocking for most people to see. But from your perspective, what are the topics and issues that you're most excited to cover and explore in future episodes of EU Screams? And in general, how do you envision the podcast evolving in the upcoming years? We've seen a big raise in vidcasts as well. So is this something that you're considering? Are there, amendments and alterations that you're considering for the podcast scene?
So, yeah, sorry, I missed one part of that. Big rise in something, but did you
say participation in informal podcasts? So, for example, Kamala Harris recently joined Call Her.
No, I got all that bit, but I thought you mentioned AI or something like that, perhaps.
No, you said vidcast, I think.
Vidcast, yes.
Vidcast, video casting the podcast.
Oh, video podcast. Yeah, interesting. So first of all, in terms of the future for what we're working on now, which is indeed, this is a great question right now, because I'm plotting out essentially programming for the next couple of years, and that's very exciting. And I think first up is going to be more on tech and digital. This is if you take climate and the environment, and you take tech and digital, and you take democracy, and you take defense. These are four big areas, and they all sort of overlap, don't they? But I think with tech, and with the idea that tech is just super powerful right now in terms of the market cap of the companies involved, in the way that tech has enormous lobbying power in Washington and in Brussels, and essentially in the way that there's been, and I talked to Maricha Shaka about this, who's a former MEP, the way there's been a sort of tech coup in the sense that a lot of functions that government used to have been almost sort of usurped by the tech industry. So I think that gives you a sense of sort of what I'm thinking about, at least in the immediate term. You asked, what's going on in podcasts and in Europe. Gosh, where to start? There's a lot of exciting things going on. And look, in Washington and London, podcasts are huge. But in the US and Britain, there's a single government, a very large general public, hungry for every tidbit that you can come up with every interview, with every sort of political player. But we've got to face the facts. EU affairs is a bit different. The players do not have name recognition or like a place in our family conversations or our friends' conversations always in national markets. And the issues they discuss, of course, are famously dry and technocratic a lot of the time. And when people try and sex that EU stuff up, when they try and make European stories sound more interesting than they really are, it can be fairly strained and artificial, and people can tune out even faster than they would have done otherwise. So I personally still enjoy reading a lot about EU affairs and what's happening in the member states in the newsletters and email roundups. And those are also really, really important, I think, sources of information in the EU. In terms of one thing I want to address in terms of the tech is Notebook LM because a lot of people are talking about it, right? Is that helpful if I give a couple thoughts on that?
Go for it. We published one on the EU influencer event. Actually, yeah, you saw it, I think, on LinkedIn.
I did. I heard it, and it was Notebook LM, and this is of course technology where you can you can literally plug text or websites or whatever into this software, which is entirely free, and within 3-4 minutes, it produces a podcast with a man and a woman talking about the content. It's amazing how it inserts pauses and emphasis words, and it's all pretty spectacular. My question is, like, how soon do we get authorized synthetic voices, right, of real people? And if that happens, where, you can have von der Leyen because she's kind of authorized her voice, do we ever end up having sort of spontaneous moments with our interlocutors, or will it just be, the handlers of these people, the cabinet aides sending in their notes for the algorithm to mix up with those from the interviewer? Because if that happens, I see that as a form of journalistic dystopia rather than, an opening of new journalistic horizons. Stuff like that. Are we going to flag it as entirely synthetic media, even if the voice has been authorized? And then once you've got sort of unlimited access to either wholly synthetic voices or ones that are authorized from these famous people or people who have some degree of name recognition, what does that do when it comes to fostering authentic, diverse voices and the people who aren't heard from enough? And EU Scream, the podcast that I founded and operate, we still make that very much a priority. Who are the people not being heard in the Brussels mix? Who are the members of civil society who are putting forward very interesting and resonant points that are just not being heard? And again, I have to ask myself, in a Notebook LM world of entirely synthetic media, is that really going to be happening? I mean, maybe it happens more, I don't know, but I think it's worth sort of asking that question.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I'll tell you what comes to mind when you say that. I think it's probably not a great analogy, but if you think about the music industry and how there was a time when people were performing, and that was how they spread their music. Then they recorded, they distributed, and increasingly the distribution became, the way they could just create once, multiply. And then because the value of that started to decrease, performance is back. So actually, people doing Taylor Swift doing her world tour is actually the experience that people want to see. It's not about just hearing the music. You want to see the performance, and you need to know that that's the real person. And I think, I don't believe that synthetic media is going to replace people. I think it's just going to displace certain conversations. So, okay, maybe you're going to have, I think they already did a Ursula chatbot with an EU approved LLM. And basically, okay, so you're going to get maybe Ursula's voice saying, hey, here are the topics that I can answer. And you'll know that this is not obviously Ursula, but it's supposed to be an EU voice. But I think that, conversations like this one, when humans are together, doing a live conversation. In fact, in this case, we're recording it and we're putting it out live. So I think it just creates value for the live conversation, which becomes important. I think people will appreciate physical meetings. I mean, we've done different EU influencer formats. We did it purely online one year. It was obviously COVID related, but then, now we're getting more and more people in the room. And so I think it's just a new way to express things. So I think we're going to have an avalanche of synthetic media, which is going to be, sometimes terrible, sometimes interesting for certain topics. But I think it brings back the fact that, okay, if I can go to a physical meeting and meet the person and have, as you said, an authentic conversation, or have them for real live and not their bots, that becomes where the value is. So I think it's a displacement rather than a replacement. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm certainly hopeful that that would be the case. And these tools are, I mean, no one, I'm not a Luddite about them. Don't get me wrong. I do believe that they can be very useful add-ons to what we're doing, and they can maybe even expand the kinds of content and the kind of reporting that's done. So yes, I mean, one would hope for that, but I mean, there is a kind of I mean, we do have to be careful, I think, especially as journalists, about marking content as synthetic when it is synthetic. We have to be careful as journalists to make sure that the platform companies are under an obligation to make sure that when they are scraping content, be it audio, be it text, that there is some form of compensation for the content creators. There are many aspects of what is happening in synthetic media that raise questions, just like happened when social media first popped up, about future monetization of original content.
Yeah, no, I think there's still a lot to deal with, and this is still a very, very new phenomenon. Daniel, by the way, says that it was nice to see James as a panelist on the EU influencer, and he says, I think synthetic media will fill some holes that we didn't know there were, but at the same time there'll be a reaction from the audiences that will value more, in the case of podcasts, when it's done by real people. And I think, by the way, I've read that voters, especially in the US, do not like AI generated content if it's advertised as such. And so a lot of the campaign teams have decided not to use very fancy AI tools because it had actually the opposite effect, which is kind of interesting. I suspect people will get used to it. So there'll be places where, okay, it can help answer a conversation. But I think it's been interesting. It's not been the tsunami of AI disinformation that some people predicted. And with that in mind, I want to come back to you, James. I mean, with all these new tools, AI, crazy channels all over the place, when you meet somebody who says, I want to become, I don't know, a journalist or a podcaster or both, what is your advice to them?
So this is a great question. I mean, I think what we had discussed before is like, what is the advice for young communicators, right? So that could cover a variety of callings in media. And I think there's a sort of basic journalistic demand that it's always a good idea to keep in mind, which is something that I beg people to do, which is to talk in specifics when they're talking about stuff that's happening on their beats, or with the politician that they're looking after, or the organization that they're working with. In other words, don't talk about a framework or a directive or an article of the law, but at least try and strip that away, even if it's just for a moment, and see how it sounds. If you take a moment to talk about an actual person with an actual name doing a real thing in a real place, like a court or a parliamentary hearing, and they're doing that to a real company or to a real country, and if that happens, describe what the real life consequences would be, X, Y, Z, on the general public or an app or whatever. I mean, maybe you're not going to get that past your supervisor at the end of the day, but please, please, please have a go, because that if you can land something that is specific and has that kind of concrete edge to it, you are communicating and you are escaping some of the pathologies of the Brussels bubble.
No, I think that's an excellent point. In fact, last week we were talking to David Henning about policy communication, and he was saying something I think that connects to you. It's like, if you don't communicate properly about policy, you actually, in today's day and age, you can't implement that policy. So you need to explain, especially he was talking about trade policy, he was talking about Brexit. It's like, it has been very, very badly communicated. And I think if you can't explain why this thing matters to people and how it is, and I think, in Brussels especially, people are still used to the technocratic age where you didn't need to explain in terms of story and you just needed to come up with your policy dossier. That's not enough. And I think you're absolutely right. Having journalistic perception and language is incredibly important. So now we're going to move to our recommendations for books and podcasts to our listeners and viewers. So, James, what is your recommendation, your book recommendation, I believe?
So my book recommendation, and I really encourage people to have a look at this if they think it could benefit them. There's a science journalist called James Nestor, and he wrote a book called Breath or Breathe 4 years ago, The New Science of a Lost Art. On the one hand, it's about illness like chronic congestion, sinus infections, lung disease, but it also really can improve our well-being and evenness and tone of breath. And that's good for public speaking. I'm working through the book right now. I'm grossly oversimplifying what this involves, but essentially it's breathe more through the nose. You got to use it or you lose it. And as much as possible during exercise, breathe in less and breathe out more. So let me just tell you, I've been trying to follow this. And I've been doing 2 breaths in and then 5 out while running. You do feel like you're suffocating, but you also feel like you can run forever because your muscles aren't getting tired. I've taken a full minute off my pace in the last 3 weeks. So I've gone from 6:42 kilometers pace to 5:42, and I'm totally psyched. Yeah.
Excellent. No, I think it's fantastic. I'm aware of that. And if you go on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, you're going to find a lot of discussion about breathing. But you're right. And it's basically don't be a mouth breather. And the impact that not breathing properly has on your health at all aspects is amazing. And I totally agree. It's very important thing to do.
And if you master it, and the way that you can, control your tone in public and da-da-da. Yeah.
Yeah, and you had a second recommendation, I believe.
I do. I was going to recommend against popular consensus, Joker, Folie à Deux, this new film in the Joker series. Look, it's really different from the first film. It's way weirder, part musical, part prison drama, part courtroom drama. It kind of picks off where the last movie left off, but in a really important way. Joker is still a hero to the outside world. He's killed this glib talk show host in a very brutal way. But the filmmaker is really playing with us. The viewer, I think, and this is where I land, I think we are being asked whether we came to this film because we also put charismatic, nasty people on a pedestal. I mean, the Joker is a really disturbed individual. He's very, very ill. But in this film, it's like it's our hypocrisy on trial. And the film's length really literally twists the knife into our hypocrisies. And I can see that a lot of viewers are not enjoying that. And this film is most definitely not for everyone. But as a meditation on how we are fascinated with evil, as long as it's a spectacle, as long as it's in crazy, lurid makeup, the film is great. And, think about it. What would happen if Trump suddenly turned from this carnival barker, this rabble rouser, always on the edge of doing something unpredictable and outrageous, and he suddenly turned into this level-headed, sane-sounding person who gave his insane views in a more sort of normal way? Well, maybe his fans, the media, the fascination would drop away. Even the media would feel deflated because there's no longer this circus clown doing this stuff, just like Lady Gaga in the film. So when the Joker reverts to being ordinary Arthur Fleck, she loses interest entirely. And I found this really resonant.
Excellent. Well, you've already got Gaia, who said she loved the movie. Daniel saying he has to go and watch it. Now, actually, you made it really, you sold it very well. I definitely am very curious to see what it's about. And Gaia is saying Woman of the Hour, also actually quite a fascinating movie. Evie, what are your recommendations for our viewers and listeners?
My recommendation thing is very simple in comparison to James, because I'm blown away by the breathe technique. I'm very into sports lately, so I will definitely check it out, the book, and also the advice on the TikTok and video field, because I'm a video person now. My recommendation is a YouTube channel called The Future. It focuses on the business of design and marketing, providing insights on branding, content marketing, and client engagement strategies. I think that it takes some concept that sometimes can be a bit more complex and simplifies them. So it's worth checking it out, especially for people getting started in marketing or wanting to, refresh some of the concepts in their minds.
Yeah, I think Daniel's actually a big fan of The Future. Very good podcast for communicators and entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So I will end with my recommendation, a book I finished recently, Invisible Rulers by Renee DiResta. A fantastic overview of the conversation on misinformation. She's an academic. She did some deep research into the anti-vax movement, into political communication, and how we're living in a world of kind of fragmented reality because of social networks, increased polarization. And I mean, the analysis is really, really deep and very, very interesting. Then, of course, as I think everybody seems to do it now, she brings in her own story because she's been at the receiving end of hate campaigns, which, ironically, I've been reading another book by Dan Ariely called Misbelief, and he's also been at the receiving end of online hate. So it seems there's a pattern there. But she provides this very interesting overview and academic framework, and then she looks at the remedy, which is complicated. It's a bit of legislation, a bit of self-regulation, quite challenging. But I think for me, understanding the world we live in and how these new channels are reshaping our perception of reality, the political dynamics of elections, and of how we form our opinions. So very interesting, pretty big read, but I think well worth it. So with that, have a fantastic and I believe sunny weekend, and we will see you online and on whatever channel you prefer. Have a fantastic weekend. Thank you, James. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Phil and Evelina. Pleasure.